"We found a buyer for your share of the property," my older sister Victoria announced, sliding a check across the polished mahogany table of the attorney's office with the casual authority of someone who already decided how this would end. "Actually," I said, "Dad wanted you to get nothing. And now you won't. Let me tell you about the inheritance my sisters tried to steal and the father who made sure they couldn't." My father, Raymond Hollister, was a complicated man. A successful architect who designed buildings across the eastern seaboard. He'd raised 3 daughters with the particular distance of someone more comfortable with blueprints than emotions. He provided for us financially while remaining emotionally absent, a pattern that shaped each of us differently. Victoria, the eldest, became his surrogate in the household, managing, controlling, deciding what the family needed without asking what anyone wanted. Margaret, the middle child, became his echo, agreeing with whoever held power at any given moment, her personality molded by the desire to avoid conflict. And me, Caroline, the youngest by 8 years, I became invisible. The afterthought. The child born when my parents' marriage was already failing, raised more by housekeepers than by family. My mother died when I was 12. My father retreated further into his work. My sisters, already adults, treated me as an obligation to be minimized rather than a sibling to be loved. The beach property was my father's crown jewel. 2 acres of oceanfront land in the Outer Banks, purchased in 1987 for what now seemed an impossibly small amount. Over the decades, as the area developed and coastal property became scarce, the value had multiplied exponentially. Dad had built a modest cottage on the land, nothing fancy, just a 3-bedroom retreat where he'd spent summers sketching designs and watching the waves. It was the only place I ever saw him truly relaxed, truly present. I'd visited whenever I could as a child, those summers the only time my father seemed to remember I existed. Victoria and Margaret came rarely. The beach was boring, the cottage was primitive, the Outer Banks lacked the sophistication they preferred. But they knew what it was worth. They'd always known. My father died in October, 3 weeks after his 76th birthday. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed too late, progression swift and merciless. By the time he told anyone, he had weeks rather than months. I flew to North Carolina immediately. Spent those final weeks at his bedside, holding his hand, listening to stories he'd never shared before, about his childhood, his failed marriage, his regrets. Victoria and Margaret arrived for the last 3 days. They brought attorneys and questions about his affairs. They discussed estate matters in the hallway while I sat with our dying father. 3 days before he died, Dad asked to speak with me alone. "There's a safety deposit box," he whispered. "At First National, downtown. Keys in my desk drawer, taped underneath. Don't tell your sisters. Don't open it until after the funeral." "What's in it?" "The truth. And protection." He gripped my hand with surprising strength. "They're going to try to take everything from you, Caroline. They've been planning it for years. This will stop them." He died before he could explain more. The will my sisters produced was dated 2 years ago. It divided Dad's estate into 3 equal portions, a straightforward arrangement that seemed fair on the surface. The beach property, the most valuable asset, would be sold and proceeds split equally. Except Victoria had already found a buyer, a development company she'd been in contact with for months, offering $1.2 million for the land. Her plan was simple: control the sale, manage the paperwork, and ensure that equal portions became whatever she decided they should be. The $12,000 check she offered me represented her calculation of my worth, 1% of an inheritance I was legally entitled to 1/3 of. Dad wanted it this way, Victoria insisted when I refused to sign. He always said the property should stay with family who actually cared for it. I cared for it. I spent summers there. I was with him when he died. You were with him because you had nothing better to do. No career, no husband, no responsibilities. Some of us have actual lives. Some of you have actual greed. Her face reddened. Sign the papers, Caroline. Take the $12,000 and be grateful you're getting anything. Dad's estate has debts, expenses, the property is the only liquid asset. Margaret and I have managed everything while you did nothing but hold his hand. Managing isn't the same as inheriting. And $12,000 for 1/3 of $1.2 million isn't equal division, it's theft. If you refuse to cooperate, we'll have you declared legally incompetent. We have documentation of your instabilities. The threat hung in the air. I knew what documentation she meant: the depression I'd struggled with after Mom died, the therapy sessions my father had paid for, the year I'd taken off from college to get my mental health stabilized. Victoria had been saving those records for exactly this moment. But I had the safety deposit box. I'd retrieved it the day after the funeral, following my father's instructions precisely. Inside was a folder containing documents that would destroy my sister's careful plans. A new will. Dated 3 months before his death. Notarized, witnessed by his oncologist and his longtime accountant, two people with no financial interest and impeccable credibility. The new will was devastatingly specific. I pulled the documents from my bag and set them on the attorney's table. Before we continue, I'd like to submit this for review. A will dated August 15th of this year, superseding any previous testamentary documents. Victoria S. Attorney, a man she clearly hired for his willingness to facilitate questionable transactions, picked up the papers with obvious skepticism. His expression changed as he read. This appears to be a valid holographic will. Handwritten, signed, dated, and witnessed. It's a forgery, Victoria snapped. Dad would never. I'd recommend having it authenticated before making accusations, the attorney said carefully. If this is valid, it substantially changes the estate distribution. What does it say? Margaret asked, speaking for the first time. I read the relevant portions aloud. I, Raymond Thomas Hollister, being of sound mind, hereby revoke all previous wills and testamentary documents. Victoria's jaw tightened. To my eldest daughter, Victoria, I leave the sum of $1, in recognition of the decades she spent viewing me as a source of funds rather than a father. She has taken enough during my lifetime through manipulation and financial pressure. She will take nothing more. Victoria's face went white. To my middle daughter, Margaret, I leave the sum of $1, for the same reasons. She has followed Victoria's lead in treating me as an obligation rather than family. Her inheritance matches her contribution to my life. Margaret made a small sound of distress. To my youngest daughter, Caroline, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate, including but not limited to, the beachfront property in Dare County, North Carolina, my investment accounts, my architectural drawings and intellectual property, and all personal possessions. She is the only one who visited without wanting something. The only one who sat with me as I died. The only one I trust to honor what I built. The silence in the room was absolute. That's not possible, Victoria managed. Dad wouldn't, we're his daughters. You were his daughters who saw him twice a year when you needed money. I was his daughter who spent summers at the beach house, who called every Sunday, who dropped everything to be with him when he was dying. The money was always for family purposes. The money was always for your purposes. I have records, Victoria. Bank statements showing the loans you never repaid. Credit card bills Dad covered without telling Mom. The down payment on your house that you called an advance on inheritance. Her face twisted. He gave those things willingly. He gave them to stop your harassment. There's a difference. I pulled out another document from the folder. He also left me a letter explaining his decision. Would you like me to read it? The letter was 4 pages long, handwritten in my father's careful architect's script. I read portions that were relevant to the moment. Victoria learned early that pressure produced results. She would threaten, manipulate, and exhaust me until I gave her what she wanted. Margaret followed her lead, the two of them forming an alliance that treated me as a resource to be extracted. Caroline never asked for anything. She visited because she wanted to see me, not because she needed something. She listened to my stories, appreciated my work, sat in comfortable silence while I sketched. She was the only one of my children who ever knew me as a person rather than a provider. I've made many mistakes as a father. I was distant, preoccupied, unable to express the love I felt for all 3 of my daughters. But I will not make the mistake of rewarding greed and punishing genuine affection. Victoria and Margaret have received their inheritance in advance, through decades of taking. Caroline will receive what remains, not because she asked for it, but because she never did. Victoria stood abruptly. This will be contested. We have the previous will, properly filed, legally valid. A later will supersedes an earlier one, her own attorney said quietly. If this document is authenticated, the previous will becomes void. Then we'll prove it's forged. The witnesses are Dr. Samuel Morrison, Dad's oncologist for the past 6 months, and Theodore Blackwell, his accountant for 30 years. Both are prepared to testify that Dad was completely lucid when he signed, and that he asked them specifically to witness because he knew you'd try to contest. Margaret began crying. Dad wouldn't do this to us. He loved us. He did love you. That's why this was so hard for him. I pulled out the final document, a cover letter from my father's handwriting, addressed to me personally. Caroline, I know your sisters will be hurt by this decision. I know they'll claim I was manipulated, confused, or incompetent. That's why I've had this will witnessed by professionals who can testify to my mental state. And why I've left it with you rather than with an attorney they could pressure. You're wondering if this is fair. It isn't, not entirely. Fair would have been raising 3 daughters who loved each other and me equally. Fair would have been a family that didn't require a will to distribute affection and obligation. But fair isn't possible anymore. All I can do is try to correct the imbalance, to give the most to the one who asked for the least, to stop rewarding the behavior I spent a lifetime enabling. Keep the beach house. It was always yours in every way that mattered. And forgive me for not being the father you deserved while I was alive. This is my apology, written in legal terms because I never learned to speak in emotional ones. The authentication took 3 weeks. Handwriting analysis confirmed the will and letter were genuine, my father's script, my father's ink, my father's paper from the architectural firm stationery he'd used his entire career. The witnesses provided depositions confirming the circumstances, a dying man, fully lucid, determined to set things right before he ran out of time. Victoria hired her own experts, contested the mental capacity determination, filed motions to delay and obstruct. The legal battle she threatened materialized, dragging through courts for 7 months. She lost every challenge. The oncologist's testimony was devastating. Raymond Hollister had been sharp and determined until the end, asking detailed questions about his prognosis and making careful arrangements for his affairs. He'd specifically mentioned his concern that his older daughters would try to disinherit his youngest, and he'd taken steps to prevent it. The accountant's testimony was equally damaging. He'd reviewed the financial records at Raymond's request, documenting the decades of loans and advances Victoria and Margaret had extracted. The total exceeded $340,000, money my father had provided under pressure and never been repaid. The previous will, it emerged, had been drafted by an attorney Victoria had recommended, a firm that specialized in family wealth management and had close ties to her husband's business. The circumstances of its creation were questionable enough that the judge noted them in her ruling. The final judgment awarded me the entire estate. The beach property. The investment accounts. The architectural drawings that had historical as well as monetary value. Everything my father had built over 50 years of work, left to the daughter who'd asked for nothing. Victoria and Margaret received their $1 each, a symbolic amount that communicated my father's assessment of their worth more clearly than any explanation could. The development company that had been prepared to buy the property withdrew its offer when it became clear Victoria didn't have the authority to sell. I received inquiries from other buyers, offers that climbed as the market continued rising. I declined them all. The beach house is mine now. I visit every month, staying in the cottage my father built, watching the same waves he watched, sitting in the chair where he sketched his final designs. I found his last drawings in a closet, plans for an expansion to the cottage, a second story with a studio where he'd hoped to work in retirement. He'd never had the chance to build it. I'm building it now. Hiring the contractors, sourcing the materials, following his blueprints as closely as the original construction will allow. When it's finished, I'll have a home that's entirely his design, his final gift, realized by the daughter he trusted to honor it. Victoria and Margaret haven't spoken to me since the court ruling. I've received letters from their attorneys, attempts to negotiate, to reopen discussions, to find some accommodation that might give them a share of what they believe they deserved. I haven't responded. Not from cruelty, from clarity. My father made his wishes explicit after decades of implicit suffering. He spent his final months ensuring that his intentions couldn't be circumvented, his legacy couldn't be hijacked. Honoring that means accepting the family he chose to create in death, even if it meant breaking the family that had fractured long before. The $12,000 check Victoria offered me sits framed in my home office. A reminder of what she thought I was worth. What she believed she could get away with. The contempt that had defined her treatment of me since I was old enough to understand what contempt meant. Next to it hangs my father's letter, the apology he never spoke aloud, the love he never learned to express, the acknowledgement that came too late but came nonetheless. He saw me. In the end, he saw me. That's worth more than any property, any inheritance, any legal victory over sisters who never saw anything but what they could take. Dad wanted it this way, Victoria had said, trying to justify her theft with our father's alleged wishes. She was right, just not in the way she intended. Dad did want it this way. He wanted the daughter who loved him to receive what he'd built. He wanted the daughters who used him to face the consequences of that using. He wanted, for once in his life, to say what he actually meant instead of what was expected. The safety deposit box was his voice from beyond the grave, clear, final, undeniable. And when I pulled those documents out and watched my sisters' faces transform from confidence to horror, I understood what he'd given me. Not just property. Not just money. Justice. Delayed by decades, delivered at last. Dad wanted them to get nothing. And now they won't.